In today's modern market, the movie industry seems to be dominated by box office numbers. Never has that been more apparent than in the current pandemic, where release dates are regularly pushed back to maximise the potential audience and profit. Of course, this is nothing new. Since the days of silent cinema, there has always been event movies. Whether it be the works of Griffith, Chaplin or Keaton, or the later talkie epics such as Gone with the Wind, Hollywood developed a knack for producing large-scale, big-budget event movies that would draw in the crowds. This model became rather stagnant by the 1960s, however, as old Hollywood passed over to a new, young generation of filmmakers who played by a new set of rules. Films such as The Godfather, Chinatown, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The success of these films seemed to point to a new direction that cinema would take. But it wasn't all that way. In 1975, a prodigal talent, making his first forays into big-budget cinema, transformed the outlook of the movie industry that still echoes through to today. This was the advent of the summer blockbuster. This was the beginning of high-concept cinema. This was the dawn of Spielberg. This was Jaws. Is there a more effective opening to any film? Chrissy decides to go for a swim with a guy she's been throwing glances at during the beach party all night, but he crashes out and doesn't make it into the water. But she's not alone. The underwater shots, the music, the tug from under the water, the sound of Chrissy's shivers as she realises what is happening, the furious thrashing across the water, slinging Chrissy from one side of the frame to the other, the "God please help" screams as she catches hold of the boy bobbing in the water, the bell ringing that drowns out her helpless screams, and then silence. A word of warning before we get into this review. This will be full of spoilers, so if you're the one person on this planet who's yet to see Jaws, I'd recommend coming back after you finally watched it. Fair warning, and on with the review. Steven Spielberg was 27 years old when he filmed Jaws. This is a fact that still astounds me to this very day. It's not that the book by Peter Benchley wasn't great source material, but anyone who's read the novel will understand that Spielberg's ability to create a universal cinema, one that resonates with all audiences, is a particular skill that I'm not quite sure anybody else has in the same abundance. His vision for the film is astonishing. Jaws was a notoriously difficult shoot. It's a film that quite honestly could have been canned right there on the set. The brilliant Jaws log by Carl Gottlieb is out there for anyone to take a deeper dive on the problems faced in the production, and I urge any fan of the film to give it a read to understand exactly what this young, and let's not forget, absolute novice director at the time was facing. But Spielberg is operating at another level here. He not only sets the blueprint for major blockbusters forever, but he also sets his own template here. Whilst he maybe becomes more famous for his universal appeal, which suggests cutesy, family-friendly material, and he has had his fair share of success in that area, he is also an absolute master of suspense. And throughout his glorious career, never was it more on show than with Jaws. And this is not just horror suspense, it's the tension displayed in characters' faces. There are so many single examples of this throughout the movie, such as Richard Dreyfuss's Matt Hooper when he first examines the remains of Chrissy and proclaims not once but twice that this was not a boating accident. It's these small interplays between the characters long before we see the shark that builds up the fear of what is lurking in the water. Spielberg is very careful to build up each of the three main characters, whether through their actions on screen such as Brody's whole fish out of water New Yorker who hates the water, or Hooper's young, cocky, wealthy shark expert who has a passion for the shark that is alien to Brody's view, or the more seasoned, grouchy, seen it all, done it all outlaw of the seas in Robert Shaw's incredible turn as Quint. The film is essentially split into two parts, but both rely as much on character as the power of the set pieces. Due to the problem with operating the mechanical shark, Spielberg was required to think on his feet. His decision to shoot the shark attacks largely from the point of view of the shark was ingenious, but just as important are the reaction shots of the characters. Take for example the famous Kintner attack. Spielberg builds the tension as we watch Brody scanning the water for signs of the shark. He's failed to close the beaches this time out due to pressure from the mayor, but we see everything through his eyes. He's idly stood by and supported a decision from higher authority, but he doesn't trust in that decision. He's constantly pestered as he sits on the beach. We get false alarms, real bad hats, and little nods to what is about to come. And then the piercing screams of Alex, as a few of the beachgoers react in horror at what they can see in the distance. And suddenly the now famous reverse dolly shot as Brody's world repels around him, the instant moment of terror and realisation of what is going on in front of him. As a single shot, this is without question one of the most effective moments in this or any film. It perfectly captures the sheer moment of panic as Brody realises the awful mistake he has made. And so begin the politics. In a way eerily prescient of our lives in lockdown in the 2020s, we see the pressure from the locals to keep the beaches open as the mayor attempts the balancing act of submitting to the pressures of safety but appealing to the needs of the local businessmen and women and somehow failing to appease either camp. It's here where we are first introduced to Quint in one of the two fantastic monologues that Shaw delivers in the movie. In one single scene we get the full sense of who this man is, an outsider, ruthless, repellent, and yet probably the only man within 100 miles who could deal with the problem, but he don't come cheap. As the 4th of July beckons, a group of amateur fishermen set out to catch the shark. First we see two men trying to catch the jump on the inevitable feeding frenzy of opportunists that will rock up from all around for the $3,000 bounty. They opt to go out at the break of dawn with the wife's roast and catch the shark before anybody else gets out there. It's a small sequence, but it's a great measure of the all-round brilliance to be found in the film. We still don't see the shark, but as a small pier is ripped from beneath the men's feet, one of them is pulled slightly out to sea, and Spielberg brilliantly uses the groaning, turning wood to indicate the shark's looming presence. The scene quickly turns into a race for the man's survival as he is chased by the invisible killer, with only inches to spare. In another brilliant sequence, a group of fishermen do indeed catch a shark, and Brody is briefly elated before he is quickly brought back down to earth with a crushing double blow. Alex's mother pays a visit after the funeral, delivering a sickening reminder of the loss already felt due to the earlier inaction, and more significantly, Hooper has some more damning news to deliver. Yet again, the scene in which Hooper comes over to Brody's house is perfect. Brody is at his lowest, but a brief reprieve with his younger son lightens the mood for the viewer. This is where Spielberg is in a class of his own. He never allows his film to lose that appeal to the audience. A simple moment of interplay between father and son is all that's needed to alleviate some of the depression, but it is still tinged with sadness. The sadness in Brody's drunk eyes as we understand he is also brutally aware that a young boy, not much older than his son sat in front of him, will never be able to share these moments again. At which point the brash Hooper delivers his damning verdict, and the two men instead decide to pursue their investigation in secret. This is important for the film. We're allowed to see naivety in our leads. We can watch them make mistakes and indeed pay for them, but they have to be aware of this themselves. This vulnerability is something that all of the best of Spielberg's characters possess. They make mistakes, but they will act on it for the right outcome. Another important trait is bravery. At one point or another, Spielberg's heroes must always show a selflessness, whether it's Dr. Grant in Jurassic Park protecting the kids from the T-Rex, or various times Dr. Jones has stared death in the face. In Jaws, we watch as Hooper dives into the sea in search of the beast, a little night fishing of his own, only to come away with a tooth and a scare that he, and we, will never forget. The tooth is a clue that the problem is still upon the small seaside town, and the two men campaign to close the beaches, but it's all in vain. The 4th of July is now only days away, and the mayor is now completely unwilling to budge. these beaches will be open. The next beach sequence is arguably more effective than even the Kintner tragedy. Here, Spielberg throws every trick in the book. We get the fake out with the two kids playing a trick. We get the army of police and lifeguards on watch. We get the mayor persuading some of his cronies to get in the water to influence others. And we get that moment of reprieve. But in the quiet pond, far off from the watchful eye of the main beach, something is lurking in the water. The reaction shot of Brody as his wife tells him his son is in the pool is just as effective as the reverse dolly. Here we get the very slow realisation where Brody first wanders, then moves to a slight jog, and before long is sprinting, ushering everyone out of his way as he now suddenly realises what is at stake. And as Spielberg pans out to the sea, the audience takes a moment to let out a breath and realise it's been taken away from us for the past half of the film by something we've hardly seen, lurking out there in the endless ocean. Now, it's time for the second act. It's time for Quint. As much as the first half of Jaws is an incredible thrill ride, the second and third act is inarguably the point where the film goes down in history. This is where the character side of the film truly comes into play. It is where Jaws will never be touched by a single one of its followers. Before we even get onto the boat, we get the scene in Quint's lobby in the beginning of the quick-witted jibes between him and Hooper's rich boy that he despises. The shot of the drink, the study of the hands, it's all these little moments that just make the film so rich. As the boat sets off to sea, we hear Quint's songs and cackles of laughter. It's entertaining on a first watch, but it becomes so much more endearing with each rewatch, because we know what's ahead. There are a few extensions of that interplay we saw at Quint's place on the boat, further displaying each character's trait. We get Brody's naivety when he pulls the wrong cord and releases the gas canisters. We get the cup duel, which is probably the funniest moment in the whole film. And we get the first majestic face-off between Quint and the shark, or so we think, until Hooper steps in. We finally get our head-on meeting with the shark, after the brief showing in the pond sequence before. Not content with being at the top of its game in every other department, Jaws also now provides us with one of the most quotable phrases in history too.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
A special mention to the use of the barrels here too. What an incredible filmic device this is. It's written into the story, but simply on a directing level, the film really could have fallen apart in the second half. There are so many examples out there of films with brilliant build-up that collapse in the end because they have no answer but to expose everything during the climax. Imagine Jaws without the barrels. How many times would we have seen a shark fin stick out of the water? How many times would this be effective? But what if we fix a beeping shark monitor to a barrel and harpoon it to the shark? We now have a sound device to add tension and a visual cue without ever having to display the shark. It's just yet another brilliant extension of those POV shots, or Chrissy being thrown about, or when the sea turns red around Alex. Spielberg's constant use of motifs in place of the physical shark is exceptional. This guy was 27 years of age at this point, remember. But the moment where it all comes together is in the cabin of the boat. A drunken night shared amongst the three men, where we hear tales of tragedy in the Indianapolis speech, and moments of levity such as Mary Ellen Moffat, she broke his heart. It's all wonderful face value entertainment, but dig a little deeper and you see the true genius in the scene. Take for example the comparisons of Scars. Sure, it's funny, hilarious in fact at times, but it's a brilliant piece of observation too. As Quint and Hooper square off against each other to see who's got more experience, this is a battle between the two men, and yet Spielberg tops it all off with a short glance to Brody as he lifts up his shirt, pondering over whether to mention a scar of his, just to simply fit in with the crowd. It's such a wonderful little moment. It perfectly sums up Brody's position within the camp, and it's the kind of little nod that only the best filmmakers understand to make. Another example in the very same scene is where the boys all sing along to Show Me the Way to Go Home. When the shark hits, the reaction of each man tells you exactly who each one of them is. Watch closely as Quint stops and looks around as he hears a bang. Then a few moments pass as the younger Hooper also realises. And watch further as Brody carries on singing along without any realisation of what's happening because he's so new to this world. These moments captured are for me equal to any of the subtle brilliance you see in any director's work. If ever anyone questions if Spielberg is a director of quality rather than simply success, just point them to this sequence in the cabin. It is the most definitive statement on his genius, and I've barely even touched on the Indianapolis speech. From the cabin onwards, the relationship begins to strain slightly. Quint develops an Aguirre-esque sense of absolute determination to fight the odds and win without any regard for his fellow passengers. Whereas before the men would dispute their approaches, questioning tactics, now Quint has locked into a frame of mind that may well endanger the lives of the men. He's hell-bent and maniacal by this point, as Hooper and Brody look on. Brody is still the most vulnerable as he looks for consolation from Hooper, but there's none to be found. As one thing after another falls apart, the shark almost begins to play mind games with them until there is no solution other than for Hooper to go into the water. You go in the cage, cage goes in the water, shark's in the water, our shark. And boy is he in the water. As Hooper is submerged in his cell with his tiny little pinprick device, by this point it's hard to not feel like this is a complete suicide mission, doomed to fail. And as almost silence fills the screen for a moment or two, it takes two notes to tell us everything we need to. John Williams is a legendary composer, often scoring Spielberg's movies along with, of course, the Star Wars franchise. This means that I'd wager a bet that nearly everyone on the planet has heard his music at one point or another. He's a creator of very symphonic and bombastic scores that almost tell you how to feel. That's not a criticism, it's a very difficult task to achieve, while also creating something so memorable. The Star Wars theme is a classic example. One of my personal favourites is in Jurassic Park as Sam Neill's Dr. Grant looks out on the landscape as Williams' score rises to a crescendo. It's pure cinema. But like with Spielberg, Jaws is Williams' finest moment. It can be a bombastic score when it needs to be, full of strings and wildly orchestral, but it's the power of those two notes that tell you everything. The use of quiet and loud is also so effective, and it's why I choose this underwater sequence to talk about the music specifically. It's sheer silence as Hooper drops into the water, then we hear the menacing as the sea darkens in the distance, then it drops out again. And then there's yet another moment of perfectly executed horror. With Hooper gone, from here on out the film ramps up to a non-stop thrill ride of horror, tragedy and blissful action. First we get Quint's fateful final meeting with the beast he's spent his life chasing. The Indianapolis speech resonates around the scene. Quint, who still hasn't put on the life jacket, slips away from Brody's hand and finally into the waiting jaws of the great white shark. And finally, after all the foreshadowing of Brody's naive, inexperienced seagoer, the New Yorker who didn't want to move to Amity, the chief who wanted to close the beaches and keep everyone out the water, the guy who until a few days prior couldn't even tie a bowline knot, is here, face to face with his terror that he, and we as an audience, never want to face. Even this sequence is more than it has to be. To go back to my point around the book versus the film, aside from some of the weird subplots that Spielberg wisely extracts from this adaptation, it's his constant brilliance of framing the suspense that matters the most. As the boat begins to sink, Brody climbs to the last remnants that remain above the surface, and now it's a true face-off as the shark hurtles towards Brody, slowly slipping towards his doom. He's got a handful of shots to hit this canister in the shark's mouth. He needs only one thing.
Well, you son of a...
There aren't many films like Jaws. For me, even Spielberg never topped it. As we see Brody bobbing in the water at the end and Hooper popping back up to be reunited, as they begin their swim back to the shore, every time I watch these final moments, I simply sit back in awe at the spectacle I've just sat through. It never gets old. It should never have been this good, and yet somehow it's perfect. The score, the direction, the acting, it all comes together to make a flawless film. It's the Beatles of movies. It was simultaneously the best and most commercially successful film of its time, and every blockbuster will forever be compared to it. I don't need to tell you to watch it. I'm sure you already have. Instead, I'll just tell you to watch it again